Hey there, I'm Joshua Johnson. It's good to be with you on this Wednesday, August 10th, and here's some of what we're talking about tonight. A detailed timeline is emerging on the FBI search of former President Trump's Mar-a-Lago home, and response from the right is growing louder, with Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell weighing in. Meanwhile, in New York, Mr. Trump opts to plead the fifth. Today, he was deposed by the state attorney general in an investigation into the Trump Organization. We'll dig into where that case goes from here. Plus, the summer of inflation is cooling off, but not by much. More on today's Consumer Price Index report and what it means for your wallet. And some climate activists are calling the provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act transformative. We'll answer more of your questions on this bill. Former President Trump is speaking out more about the FBI search of his Mar-a-Lago residence. Today, he posted on his social network, Truth Social, he addressed the boxes of records at the center of all this. It reads in part, quote, "In early June, the DOJ, Department of Justice, and FBI asked my legal representatives to put an extra lock on the door where boxes were stored in Mar-a-Lago. We agreed. They were shown the secured area and boxes themselves." He goes on to write, quote, "Then on Monday, without notification or warning, an army of agents broke into Mar-a-Lago, went to the same storage area, and ripped open the lock," unquote. Other accounts of that search contradict Mr. Trump's version of events. A Secret Service official says they knew the FBI was coming and let the agents into Mar-a-Lago. They arrived around 9 that morning and left around 6:30 that evening. That contradicts the president's claim that they broke in. Meanwhile, the Washington Post, according to people familiar with discussions leading up to the search, is reporting that it apparently stemmed from growing concerns that Mr. Trump and his team were holding on to key presidential records and that his representatives were not being entirely truthful about them. The Justice Department and the FBI have not commented on the search. That's not unusual. They rarely comment on an ongoing investigation. A number of the former president's supporters have been very vocal. Today, a statement from Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell demands, quote, "a thorough and immediate explanation of what led to the events of Monday," unquote. A group of House Republicans had dinner with Mr. Trump last night in Bedminster, New Jersey. His family is spending the summer at his golf resort there. And a number of other GOP lawmakers have expressed support for him as well. Let's begin with NBC Justice reporter Ryanilly, who joins us now. Ryan, what is your sense of the post that the former president put online? Does that confirm or clarify anything for us?
Not a ton. I think it goes into a little bit of the backstory about how this sort of all came about. And the Wall Street Journal also has some new reporting on this about these ongoing talks between the Justice Department and representatives of Trump about these records that were being held at Mar-a-Lago. I think it's something that we have to continue to take a look at and realize that there were a lot of records here. What Trump's claim, I think, is going to be is that he had declassified some of these. But what may end up being the key issue is whether or not that declassification was in any way documented. There is a suggestion from Kash Patel, who is one of the Trump administration officials, a few months back, sort of trying to get ahead of this story. I think that Trump had declassified a number of records that he thought the American people should see. But there apparently was no documentation of that, and you're not supposed to just, declare something out loud. You have to actually document that in some way to confirm that that information is declassified. So, there are still a lot of open questions here. And as you mentioned, the Justice Department is really playing this very close to the vest and by the book because this is such a sort of extraordinary move. I mean, I think if they had it their way, we wouldn't even have any indications that there was a search of Trump's estate on Monday because they kept it so under wraps. They didn't even have the FBI agents wearing any of their typical uniform, their FBI jackets that they typically go in with. So I think they really did try to keep this pretty locked down and not have anything that would have been derogatory information about the former president here. But the former president chose to put that out himself. So that's sort of a decision that he made. But we're only really hearing mostly from his side of the scenario. And that's where we're getting most of the details from at this point, Josh.
Right. Yeah, that's some of the video from outside Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach. Sorry about that on the screen. It's not West Palm, it's Palm Beach, near where that FBI search warrant was executed. But with regard to what the DOJ and the FBI did, you kind of alluded to this, both just now and in a piece that you wrote on NBCNews.com about how the DOJ has kind of bet its future on the way that this goes. There's all of this politics around the search, and it seems like they must be aware of the impact that could have both on the investigation and just on their legacy, on their legitimacy with the public.
Certainly, and from DOJ's perspective, when they hear all of these calls for explaining themselves, what they hear is, oh, you want us to break our current policy. You want us to break our longstanding policy, the way that we always handle these things. And I think if we know anything about Merrick Garland, it's that he wants to play this by the book. And I think that that's what we've seen just from reporting this out, is that they are very careful about the information that they are releasing. And it's difficult to get even basic facts confirmed about this ongoing probe. They really want to remain silent on it. And it would be a tremendous break in protocol if they came forward and suddenly made derogatory statements about the former president. And I had, one official say that. Is like that what Republicans want? Is that, do they want the Justice Department to come out and try this case in the press and just basically make these declarations about Trump's conduct without making those declarations in court and having it be tested by the court system? Because that's how DOJ typically operates. They bring their cases through the court system, and they work within the so-called four corners of the indictment, the theoretical indictment. In this case, they want to speak only through the court. And I think that, many would argue that the way we got a Trump presidency in the first place was by DOJ breaking those protocols, or rather the FBI specifically, when James Comey held that press conference regarding former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. That was widely seen as what swung the election, especially that letter that came just a few days before the 2016 election. So I think that, that's been even more heavily ingrained in DOJ and the FBI in the years since, that, they have tremendous power to swing presidential elections here. And I think that they want to be particularly careful about what they're doing. And in many ways, I think they gave the former president a little bit of a break here. They accommodated him in ways that weren't necessarily true for normal criminal suspects in this case. So, I think we should take all of these attacks for what they are. Someone who is potentially trying to minimize or escape potential culpability for any actions that he might have allegedly took regarding classified documents.
All right, thank you, Ryan. That's NBC Justice reporter Ryan Riley starting us off tonight from our Washington bureau. Now, this is not the only open investigation involving the former president. He was here in New York today for another one. The state's Attorney General Letitia James is investigating the Trump Organization's business practices. Today, she deposed him with questions about the civil investigation. Mr. Trump says that he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and did not answer questions. After the deposition, a statement from Attorney General James confirmed that the investigation continues. Let's continue now here in studio with Sarah Azari, a white-collar criminal defense attorney. Ms. Azari, welcome. Good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to see you, too. Call me Sarah.
Sarah. Good. I always start off formal in the beginning, and then we can relax after.
But we've met before.
We have. We have. The president's decision to invoke his Fifth Amendment rights, it's his right, of course, but what do you make of their tactic in terms of dealing with this investigation, which he has argued is politically motivated by Attorney General James?
Right. Another witch hunt, as he calls it. I think... Josh, the invocation of his Fifth Amendment was absolutely the way to go. Anytime you have any remote exposure criminally, and he has a lot of legal woes, as we know, you do invoke your Fifth. But it's problematic for him, and it's problematic for him on two levels. Politically, we have to think back to 2016, when in Iowa, in a campaign speech, he said, anyone who invokes their Fifth Amendment is guilty. Why would you invoke your Fifth Amendment if you're actually innocent? So by virtue of his own admission, I think then he's admitting guilt on some level, and that's a political issue. But on the legal level, this is a civil case, this investigation by AG James. And so we have to remember that in a civil case, the fact that you refuse to testify under oath in a deposition can be used against you. And in fact, if you're found to be liable, the judgment can be far heftier than it would otherwise be. So it's going to obviously hurt him in the civil case if it is filed. This is an investigation at this point, and if he's found guilty. But it was the right move for him, given his exposure.
I just want to underscore the point you just made, because I think there's this kind of, like the people watching this, independently, like, well, if you didn't have anything to hide, why didn't you testify, as you mentioned? And you said that he has said that in the past, and in the statement that he put out today, he was like, now I understand it's that much of a witch hunt, I have to plead the fifth. I just want you to underscore what you just said. It's as different in a civil matter.
Correct.
Where not testifying in your own defense, pleading the fifth, is viewed differently than in a criminal matter.
Absolutely. I mean, you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard spot, right? So you have to pick the best option. Testifying when you have exposure criminally, obviously it's really bad, because a criminal charge that, for example, the Manhattan DA's office has this parallel investigation going on, also dealing with misleading financial statements. And so his testimony, had he testified today, could be used in that investigation, which is sort of slowed down, but it's not dead yet. And but the other issue too is that yeah, I mean, basically that is it's that he had to invoke his fifth because of his criminal exposure, but that will still hurt him civilly if this case is filed.
How much do you see all of those investigations connecting? There's the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which, as you said, has kind of pulled back a little bit in some ways. There's the state investigation with New York State Attorney General Letitia James. There is the ongoing January 6th probe. There is whatever the FBI was looking for at Mar-a-Lago. And we should be clear, the former president has not been directly charged with anything yet. These are peripheral to him, but he's not facing charges. He may at some point, but he is not charged. To what degree do all of these things end up influencing one another? I understand public statements might affect him, say he says one thing in court and another thing in public, but in the eyes of the law, how much do these really overlap?
Well, I think we're dealing with multiple different jurisdictions, different agencies. So there is a disconnect to some extent. But in terms of evidence, everything is fair game. To the extent that, for example, a search of what is recovered from Mar-a-Lago reveals things that might help a case in, let's say, just hypothetically, the Manhattan DA's office or the January 6th committee. I mean, there could be some level of cooperation among these different agencies and bodies to share information that might be helpful in each other's case. But again, that the more disconnected, the less likely you'll have that cooperation. More likely that the AG's office and the Manhattan DA would cooperate with one another. The other thing I want to say, too, about him invoking his Fifth Amendment is that we also have to remember that Ivanka and Jared testified, or testified actually in depositions before the AG's office in this investigation, and Alan Weisselberg and the controller for Trump Organization also have had interviews with Letitia James. So Trump, being the most horrible witness that he is, going off on tangents, being a bad liar, would not have done himself any justice by testifying, because he would have made statements that would be inconsistent and really flawed testimony. Speaking
of making statements, I'd love your sense of some of the calls for DOJ and FBI to make some kind of public statement about these investigations. They rarely do that. I mean, James Comey did that once very famously with regard to Hillary Clinton and got smacked for it very publicly. FBI and DOJ are usually tight-lipped as a matter of policy, but this is an unusual situation. What about this case?
No, it is policy, and it's for good reason, because number one, you are trying to protect the integrity of an ongoing investigation. Number two, you're also trying to protect the rights of the subject or the target, even if it is Donald Trump. So I think for Garland to sway from that would be a big mistake. But we do need to hear from him. We do need to know why there was this unprecedented, intrusive execution of a search warrant, because to me, I mean, there's a lot we don't know, Josh, but to me, there were weeks that went by between the June turning over of boxes, I think 15 boxes to the National Archives, then went to the DOJ, and then now the August 8th execution of the warrant, which tells me that maybe there was some level of cooperation expected between Trump's team and the DOJ that sort of fell through, and they felt like they needed to go and preserve this evidence before it's destroyed somehow.
Real quick before we go, you mentioned in terms of protecting the former president's rights by not saying too much publicly. Elaborate on that.
Well, anybody that's accused or anybody that's being investigated for a crime, they have rights, even if they're charged or not charged. And so, my point is that for Garland to come out and provide details about an open investigation that is not concluded, there's inevitably going to be things that he's going to say that might be taken the wrong way. He's not proven guilty. He's not been indicted. And so we just don't, DOJ just doesn't do that until and unless there's a charge.
Criminal defense attorney Sarah Azari, good to see you again. Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming by. Thank you very much. One thing we should get to, by the way, perhaps the only way to describe the search warrant that's executed on a former president's private home is extraordinary, for sure. But problems with high-level government figures and classified information, that's not unusual. You may remember former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. She used a private email server for official business, and that included handling classified information. Last September, President Trump called Secretary Clinton's use of that server, in his words, one of the great crimes. He first made that claim during his 2016 campaign.
There has never been anything like it, and we're going to have a special prosecutor. When I speak, I go out and speak. The people of this country are furious. In my opinion, the people that have been long-term workers at the FBI are furious.
The FBI apparently did not see it that way. It recommended no criminal charges. 3 years later, a State Department investigation into Secretary Clinton found no evidence that she deliberately mishandled classified information. In short, she was cleared of wrongdoing. The same cannot be said for former CIA director and retired U.S. Army General David Petraeus. Back in 2015, he reached a deal with the Justice Department to plead guilty over giving classified information to his mistress and lying about it to the FBI. Prosecutors recommended 2 years probation and a $40,000 fine. Some in the agency criticized that decision. They argued that it could hamper future efforts to secure prison terms in leak cases. Back in 2008, the George W. Bush administration was at the center of such an investigation. The Justice Department's Inspector General found that former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales mishandled highly classified material. In 2004, former National Security Advisor Sandy Berger admitted taking classified documents from the National Archives and deliberately destroying some of it. He pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor charge. Mr. Berger was sentenced to 2 years probation and a $50,000 fine. That brings us back to former President Trump. Again, he has not been charged with anything. If it is proven that he violated federal law by taking classified documents without authorization, he could be convicted of a felony. Congress passed a bill upgrading that from a misdemeanor. President Trump signed that upgrade into law in 2018. We've got much more to talk about this hour, including inflation. It's actually easing up, but don't feel bad if you can't tell. We'll dig into what's getting cheaper and what's not.
Especially being a new dad, like we're out buying diapers.
America's gas prices are still much higher than last year, but they're coming down. AAA says today's national average is $4.01 a gallon, but many consumer costs are not coming down yet. The Bureau of Labor Statistics says overall inflation in July was up about 8.5% from a year ago, but from this June to this July, there was 0% inflation, at least on paper. Here's what that really means.
Today, we received news that our economy had 0% inflation in the month of July. 0%. Here's what that means. While the price of some things went up last month, the price of other things went down by the same amount. The result, 0 inflation last month, but people were still hurting, but 0 inflation last month.
Did you catch that? More specifically, last month prices for gasoline and natural gas utilities went down, but prices for food, electricity, and shelter went up. They kind of cancel each other out. And that's why we have to be careful when we ask if inflation is up or down. Which inflation? For what expenses? Over what span of time? It's complicated. But one thing is simple to grasp. Nearly everything costs more than last year. Food costs are up about 11%. That is the largest yearly increase since 1979. Gas is 44% higher than last year. Energy is up nearly 33%, and airfare is up nearly 28%. Let's talk through all of this with Caleb Silver, editor-in-chief at Investopedia. Good to see you again. Welcome back.
Good to be with you.
What do you make of these latest numbers in terms of some of this canceling out effect of inflation month to month, but then a a reduction year over year.
Yeah, well, it's a good sign because maybe we did actually peak a couple of months ago in terms of overall prices. Remember, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Labor Department, they look at a basket of goods because we pay for a basket of goods when we shop. Gas, energy prices, of course, those are the main drivers of inflation. And when you look inside those numbers, you mentioned food, fastest pace since 1979, butter up 26.4%, eggs 38%, coffee 20%. What are we going to do for breakfast? We're paying those costs anyway, but other things are coming down in price. Airfare actually came down in price. Gas prices, you said it, came down in price. We're seeing reductions in some places and continued rises in others. That's why we're still at this 8.5%, which we would have been tearing our hair out of our heads a year ago. Now we're kind of used to 8+%.
Well, and these are all, these various consumer price indices that go up and go down, they're all kind of interwoven, right? The price of gasoline may be going down overall, but you need certain energy forms to fuel the trucks that carry food to the grocery store, and all of that's factored in. Like, it all kind of intermixes sooner or later.
That's right. And we're paying for more in general. So if you look at across the board, that's an 8.5% increase year over year. And some things are just costing more than others because of seasonal things, because of supply chain issues, because maybe there was an oversupply of goods. So you can get great discounts at Target and Walmart because they're oversupplied in some areas. But there are other things that are still in hot demand, like new cars, like things that require semiconductors, like even electricity to cool our homes because we're in a heat wave across the country. That's all costing more.
Where do we expect to start seeing relief from some of these things? Obviously, the Biden administration has taken its own steps to try to do something about gas prices. You mentioned some of the big box retailers. They have already kind of realized, like, we're going to have to take some steps if we want to keep revenues high. So some of those costs are going to come down. But where do you think consumers are going to feel the most relief?
Well, they're starting to feel it in some places in retail because of that bullwhip effect you mentioned. When retailers are oversupplied in things that they can't sell, that's the bullwhip effect. They have to sell it at a cheaper price. So you're seeing it there. Airfares coming down. Is that people backing away from travel because prices got so high and starting to save a little bit of money? But if you look at what consumers expect in terms of inflation, their inflation expectations have come way down year over year. They're expecting inflation to run at 6.2% for the next 12 months. That's down about 2% plus. And then they're expecting inflation around 3.2% over the next 3 years. So it's going to come down slowly, but we're still going to have these elevated prices. Wage growth has been good, but wage growth is not keeping up with inflation. It's down 3% year over year, despite all the raises.
So is the goal, just in terms of policymakers, to get prices down to where they were at insert year and quarter here, or to just cope with the fact that prices are going to go up and we just need to be able to live with it?
No, the Federal Reserve is very specific about where they want inflation. Their target is 2.5% in that range. We saw that back in 2019, pre-pandemic. That was where the economy kind of sat, at 2.5%. It couldn't go higher. Now inflation's out of control. They want to bring it down to that level. It's going to take time, and it's going to take interest rate hikes, and that's what the Federal Reserve has been doing. They'll do it again in September, and they'll do it again in December until we get to about 3.25 to 3.5% on the federal prime rate.
And I'm sorry if you just answered this, but do we have a sense of how much those increases might be, or is it still to be determined?
Well, the Fed wants those rates again to be between 3.25 and 3.5%. We're about a full percentage point away, so figure another percent increase by the end of the year to get to where the Fed thinks it needs to be, interest rates need to be, in order to cool inflation without putting the economy into a deep freeze.
How are wages looking in terms of the long term? It's nice that the Fed wants inflation to be 2% per year. Wages are not rising 2% per year. Wages are flat with inflation for many, many millions of Americans. So it would be nice if Americans could keep up with the Fed's target, but most people aren't getting pay raises that would keep up no matter what.
No, and even if they did, we're still down 3% in terms of average hourly earnings once you factor in inflation. So you're still below where inflation is taking money out of your pocket because things are costing more. So you're not going to see probably a lot more wage increases. We almost have full employment here at 3.5%. We do have full employment. We know there's still a lot of jobs out there, but the wage increases are happening in the lower income jobs mostly. You're not seeing a lot in the middle, and you're not seeing a lot at the top. So wage increases will be small, and they won't keep up with inflation. Hopefully they do catch up at some point, but it's going to be a while until we see that.
Are there other pressures that bear on that? I know we think a lot about consumer price index and inflation and so on, but it'd be fine if we could afford it, right? And it's good that the lower income earners are starting to kind of come up, but even those wages were well below where they needed to be living wages. Are there any kind of market forces? Does Wall Street get it that people are not going to be able to afford products, and at a certain point, push, meet, shove?
Yeah, well, we'll see that. We haven't seen demand destruction with consumers yet because we continue to spend. But if you look inside our debt, we are spending at an aggressive rate right now. Credit card balances up 46% in the second quarter. That's up $46 billion, 13% in the second quarter. They now total $4.22 trillion. But we're not seeing a lot of bankruptcies. We're not seeing a lot of delinquencies yet. Consumers have hung in there because of all the money they got from the government over the past couple of years. We'll see how long that lasts. They'll bend. We'll see if they actually break.
And a lot of people paid off credit card debt during COVID when a lot of people were just at home.
That's right. The personal savings rate hit an all-time high. We're not there anymore, but people were able to bank money. We've been spending aggressively, but these high prices have yet to break us. They will eventually if they remain high. That's the thing we want to keep an eye on. Consumer spending, 70% of our U.S. GDP.
Investopedia's Caleb Silver, always appreciate having you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, inflation might make back-to-school shopping look a little different this year. That is especially so for families who are struggling to make ends meet. Here's NBC's Cal Perry.
Those new inflation numbers perhaps providing some hope that inflation will ease, if not this month, in the coming months. Certainly the Fed and economists are going to be looking at the numbers next month. What these numbers do show is that inflation is still high year over year. And for so many families across this country, it's about making the difficult choices of what to pay for. Take a listen to what an economist had to say about this yesterday from UCLA.
We are starting to feel some budget constraints. And so there's been a lot of data showing that consumers are pulling back on buying goods, on buying apparel, because they're spending more money on food at the grocery store. They're spending more money, at the gas pumps.
Now, these new numbers come in the middle of back-to-school shopping season, and this is a huge business across the country, $37 billion industry. The average cost for each family is some $864, probably not news to parents out there. But what we've seen is studies have shown that if you are a family that is impacted badly by inflation, you're less likely to spend the same amount of money on school supplies this year as you did last year. In fact, JLL saying about 15% less, all the more tragic because so many families continuing to make education a priority.
That's NBC's Cal Perry reporting. Up next, a big promise from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. We'll tell you what he's saying now. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Tonight's headlines begin with the war in Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky is vowing to liberate Crimea, a peninsula that Russia invaded 8 years ago. That promise came hours after a series of explosions at a Russian air base there. Ukraine's Air Force says 9 jets were destroyed. Russia denies that any attack took place. NBC's Josh Letterman is in the Ukrainian port city of Odessa with more.
Ukraine is bracing for potential retaliation after what, from all outward appearances, was a Ukrainian attack on a Russian airbase in Crimea, that section of Ukraine that has been occupied by Russia since 2014. Now, officially, Ukraine's government is not confirming that they struck the airbase there, which would be a major escalation, the first time they have done that. But Ukraine's military is pointing out that they believe that Russia lost 9 aircraft in whatever explosion took place at the Saki air base, and they say that that is really going to undermine Russia's ability to launch attacks against Ukraine from that key air base. Now, Russia has long said that if Ukraine struck in Crimea, they would retaliate as well and step up their attacks by once again targeting the capital of Kyiv. And so that is what Ukraine is waiting to see whether that will happen, even as many on social media are taking a victory lap, seeing that Ukraine is now able to push back on Russia in that territory that Russia has controlled for almost a decade now. But as there are those concerns about Crimea, we are also hearing from doctors who are treating patients on the front lines in the southern region of Ukraine who say that they are in need of some of those basic medical supplies that you would expect a modern country to have on hand. They need things like tourniquets, ambulances, even bandages to treat the wounded who are coming off the front lines. And I spoke to Dr. Eduardo Kika about what it is like in a shift in his ambulance treating those civilians and soldiers who are injured by shrapnel, by landmines and other explosions. Here's what he had to say.
We work for 24 hours, so our shift lasts a whole day. If we talk specifically about the transportation of military personnel, they are carried out here every day because patients are transported from the combat zone to the rear for further assistance. There can be from 1 to 5 of such patients per day.
Ukraine has been accepting donations of medical supplies through United 24, the country's national charity drive that was launched by President Zelensky. And today we saw how Dr. Kika was able to use an artificial ventilation device donated by other nations through that program to breathe externally for a medical dummy. Dr. Kika telling us it is one example of how those kinds of donated supplies are helping make the difference to save lives right now in Ukraine, even amid all of those concerns about shortages going forward.
That was NBC's Josh Letterman reporting from Odessa, Ukraine. It's almost been a year since U.S. forces withdrew from Afghanistan. Republicans and Democrats have criticized that move. Now, so has the man who commanded coalition forces there. This week, The Atlantic published an op-ed from retired General David Petraeus. He wrote that the U.S. made significant mistakes in its 20 years in Afghanistan. In his view, it fell short over and over again. He elaborated on those views today on MSNBC.
So there were alternatives. It would not have removed all of our boots on the ground, to be sure, but we would have kept bases in Afghanistan, which are important not just for Afghanistan, but for the regional counterterrorism campaign. And it certainly would have avoided what I think is quite a devastating situation for Afghanistan and for the Afghan people, whom we tried to help for 20 years and have literally left behind.
General Petraeus also praised the U.S. response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He said that has helped put the image of the U.S. leaving Afghanistan in the rearview mirror. We're also following a bit of breaking news tonight out of Evansville, Indiana. That's just across the Ohio River north of the Kentucky state line. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is investigating this scene. Check out all that debris. That is from what appears to be a home explosion. It killed 3 people and damaged about 39 homes. The fire department there says it stopped removing debris and searching for victims until ATF can determine what caused that blast. That's some security camera video from a home nearby. Just after the explosion, the local utility, CenterPoint Energy, arrived on the scene. Authorities say they helped to make the area safe as they can, and they're working to restore gas and electricity to the area. Evansville Fire and Police are working with the Red Cross to provide shelter to families nearby as the building inspections are underway. And we know of at least one person who's been transferred to the hospital for treatment.
After years of trying, after years of Americans calling for action, particularly our young people, Congress will pass the largest clean energy package ever. We will cut emissions by 40% by 2030, helping us avert the worst consequences.
It could be a landmark investment in fighting climate change. The Inflation Reduction Act allocates nearly $370 billion to environmental efforts. That includes $60 billion to boost domestic clean energy manufacturing and $30 billion in tax credits to accelerate domestic green energy production. Joining us now is Professor Michael Girard. He's the director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia University. Professor, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Good to be with you.
Can we back up before we talk about the new bill that is working its way through Congress? What is America's investment, the federal investment, in fighting climate change like now?
Right now, it's not nearly enough. There have been fits and starts with acting on climate change. Congress, until now, has never taken significant action on climate change. Some states are acting, but the Congress has been missing in action. EPA has been doing what it can.
What would the Inflation Reduction Act do differently?
The Inflation Reduction Act includes an enormous investment in wind and solar and transmission and storage and the other kinds of technologies that we need. It also provides tremendous incentives for electric vehicles and charging infrastructure and a whole range of research and development to make tomorrow's technologies.
What's your sense of what has the biggest impact? It seems like when the U.S. invests in new technologies or new frontiers, some of it's just like, DARPA investing in what became the internet. Other things are more like public-private partnerships, where the government kind of greases the wheels for industry, and then industry says, oh, this is looking much more like a better investment. We'll take it from here. What parts of this do you think will be the most impactful?
I think the encouragement for renewables like wind and solar, which are absolutely needed both so that we can get rid of the use of coal to generate electricity, since that's an enormous source of greenhouse gases, and because we'll need more electricity to power the motor vehicles and building heating and so forth.
Why do you think the U.S. needs to put all this money in there? My understanding was that green energy had a lot of energy in terms of investment, so to speak, and that even some of the world's longest running oil companies were beginning to shift away from fossil fuels because they like making money and they know that that's going away. How much power does the federal government really have to kickstart all of this?
A great deal, because although we are moving to renewables, we're not doing it nearly fast enough. We need to be at a greatly accelerated pace, and this new law will help us get there.
You were quoted in an LA Times article about the next fight, presuming that the Inflation Reduction Act passes, it goes to the House on Friday, and that fight will be land use. Talk about what the fight over land use will involve.
Almost all of these wind and solar projects and transmission lines need state approvals. Some of them need local approvals, and that's often a tortuous process, and often the neighbors don't want them, so they slow it down. And so we're going to have a lot of land use fights. We already have a bunch. We'll have more.
Talk about the way that the federal government intervenes in those fights, because, you know, depending on where you are in the country. Yeah, I used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area. You drive Interstate 80 towards Sacramento, you see these gigantic turbines once you get out past Vallejo. You make your way to Palm Springs. There's miles of them on your way out to Palm Springs. But even in a state like California, the environmental regulatory process, as you said, for neighbors, can get really sticky from people who are like, sorry, I paid for a view. I don't want this here.
So this law does not preempt state and local law for wind and solar. A little bit of transmission preemption, but not for wind and solar. And so we're still going to have these problems. That could have been written into the law, but it wasn't.
How does this fit into the efforts, like, you know, to make it easier for people to buy electric cars? You know, Tesla was among the companies that was working on creating coast-to-coast, you know, pathways, basically, where you could drive highways from one coast to the other and be able to recharge along the way without running out of power. How does this fit into what industry is already pushing hard on?
So there is going to be the availability of substantial rebates, discounts to people who buy electric vehicles, and also a lot of money here and in the Infrastructure Act that was passed last year for the charging infrastructure, which we need.
We got a question from a viewer that I think puts some of the U.S. efforts into a larger global context. Ray tweeted, although we need to care for our climate, the USA alone cannot solve the problem. The Paris Accord is a failure. China emits twice the carbon of the USA. Add to that India. It appears we are between the rock and the hard place. Ray, thank you for reaching out to us. I wonder if you could address two aspects of this. One, the USA cannot solve the problem alone. I think you'd agree with that. And two, his contention about the Paris Accord being a failure. What do you think of that?
Well, the Paris Accord is voluntary. It's not requiring anybody to do anything. There are voluntary pledges that countries put forward. The pledges don't add up to enough, and not everybody is meeting their pledges. But the U.S. And China and India and Japan and Europe, all the major emitters need to reduce their emissions. Unless all these countries reduce their emissions, we're not going to get there.
So these kinds of investments, there's only so much the U.S. can do, obviously, because pollution will waft from country to country with no regard to border. But in terms of what the U.S. is doing compared to what the rest of the world is doing, if the Inflation Reduction Act is signed into law, how do you think that would put the U.S. in terms of its standing among other major nations in their efforts to fight climate change? Will we be on par? Will we be ahead? Still kind of catching up?
It'll, for the first time, give the U.S. the ability to tell to others, do as we're doing, not just do as we're saying. It'll give the U.S. a lot more legitimacy. It's still not nearly enough. China is building a lot more renewables and a lot more electric vehicles than we are. We're still going to be behind them, but it'll put us in the game in a serious way.
So China is still building, kind of outbuilding us in terms of clean energy products, but they're still also polluting us in a way? Like, how does that balance work?
Yeah, they're doing both. They're still building coal-fired power plants, which is a big problem, but they're also building a lot of new renewables. Their population is so large and their economic growth is so large that that's what they're doing. Their per capita income and their per capita greenhouse gas emissions are still a whole lot lower than the U.S. It's hard for the U.S. to say to China, don't develop whereas we have using fossil fuels.
What is your sense? I know I got to let you go in just a second, but everyone I've talked to, just about everyone I've talked to about climate change for years has said it's great that people recycle, it's great that we compost, it's great that we're buying hybrid and or electric vehicles, but everything we do has no power compared to what governments can do. There is nothing we can do as individuals saying, I'm going to recycle all my plastics and cans, that is going to add up to what could be done on a federal level. What's the best case scenario if the U.S. as a nation really makes the kind of investment that perhaps you believe it should be making? What's the best case scenario?
Best case scenario is that we meet President Biden's goal that by 2030 we have a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases, and by 2050 we have net zero. But we need a lot of new technologies, a lot of action at every level to make that happen.
Would that keep us on track to the goal of preventing the world's temperature from rising by 2 degrees Celsius? That's what scientists have told us is like point of no return. We got to prevent that from happening. Would that keep us on pace, or is there more that would have to be done?
If we really achieve 50% reduction by 2030 and 100% by 2050, that's the pace we need. This law won't get us all the way there, but it's a very important step.
Is that mostly dependent on us or other nations or all of the above?
Well, for the U.S. to act, we also need EPA to use its authority. State and local governments need to act. Private companies need to act. That's just the U.S. All other countries need to act as well. We're all in this together.
Columbia professor Michael Girard, I really appreciate you talking this through with us and putting it in a bigger global context. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Monkeypox continues to spread across the U.S. There are currently more than 9,000 reported cases across the country. A public health emergency is in effect, but vaccines remain very hard to come by. NBC's Miguel Almaguer has more on the effort to fight the spread. Monkeypox continues to spread across the U.S. Currently, there are more than 9,000 reported cases across the country. A public health emergency is in effect, but vaccines remain very hard to come by. NBC's Miguel Almaguer has more on the effort to fight the spread.
Across the country, the lines still stretch for blocks as the U.S. continues to struggle to vaccinate Americans against monkeypox. This as cases now double in counties like Los Angeles and Miami-Dade.
Monkeypox is serious. Every American should take monkeypox very seriously.
After withering criticism, the administration bungled a fast deployment of vaccines from overseas. The White House declared a public health emergency last week.
How worried are you that this will become endemic?
Well, we could get ahead of it. This is not COVID. COVID, we had to shut down our schools.
Hoping to stretch the limited supply of vaccine, the FDA just granted an emergency use authorization, allowing 1/5 of the dose to be administered directly into the skin instead of a full dose into underlying fat. The U.S. invested more than $1 billion developing the vaccine, but has just over 1 million shots on hand.
But you can't think that the rollout has gone well so far.
Given where the other countries are, where we are in a far better position when it comes to the vaccines and providing access to those and to treatments.
While anyone can catch monkeypox primarily through prolonged skin-to-skin contact, so far the virus has overwhelmingly impacted men who have sex with men. In states like Georgia, the virus is disproportionately affecting the black community. Though just 1/3 of the state's population, African Americans comprise more than 80% of cases.
If it's stigmatized, people won't seek care. If it's stigmatized, people won't seek the vaccine.
Tonight, the White House hoping to control a public health emergency before it becomes a national crisis. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
Today, President Biden signed the PACT Act into law. It expands health care benefits for veterans stationed in combat zones over the last 32 years. Millions of veterans were exposed to harmful toxins during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The president says this law helps make things right.
The PACT Act is the least we can do for the countless men and women, many of whom may be in this room for all I know, who suffered toxic exposure while serving their country. It means new facilities, improved care, more research, and increased hiring and retention of healthcare workers treating veterans. This new law matters. It matters a lot.
More than 3 million veterans will now have access to additional health care benefits. Some of the burn pit victims suffer from neurological disorders, pulmonary disease, and rare forms of cancer. Finally tonight, summer travel has been a nightmare for some of us. That partly has to do with weather, but some of it has to do with pilot shortages. Now, according to the FAA, as of last year, only about 9% of pilots are women. 9%. But women are underrepresented in many different areas of aviation. Now, one camp is looking to change that. NBC's Maggie Vespa has the story.
Ava Furchoff is 14 years old. Her dream is to be a pilot.
I was really fascinated with planes, how they're built, how they could fly, ever since I was really little.
Ava spent 4 days in Wisconsin attending Girl Venture, a 4-day camp at EAA Air Venture Oshkosh, the world's largest air show of its kind.
Girl Venture is an empowerment camp for girls to let them know they can do anything that they really want to do. It also educates them to the diversity of aviation.
According to FAA data, in 2021, approximately 9% of all pilots were women, just 9%. Inspiring the next generation of pilots is critical because the U.S. is scrambling with a pilot shortage. The Bureau of Labor Statistics projects there could be about 14,500 openings for airline and commercial pilots each year for the next decade.
It is within their reach. It is something that in 8 years, hopefully they're sitting next to me in a cockpit and we're both flying a jet across the country, across the world. The fact that there is such a need and there's a demand and we can't fulfill that demand without people coming up behind us. And we need really awesome, great people who are going to be future co-workers.
During the pandemic, thousands of pilots were offered early retirement packages. Others were fired or furloughed because of lack of travel demand. The industry is experiencing a generational shift. In 2019, almost half the pilots in the air were baby boomers. But by 2029, not a single baby boomer will legally be able to fly a commercial aircraft because pilots are required to retire at 65 years old. Aspiring pilots have to log 1,500 hours of flight time. It's also no secret that learning to fly is expensive. That's why this camp teaches the girls how to write strong financial scholarship essays to help offset the costs.
We have a workshop that we put on to teach them how to research scholarships, what to put in the scholarship applications and letters to make them more viable to get.
The shortage extends to all different parts of the aviation field.
One of the things that we're doing here at the Girl Venture Camp is, of course, to encourage them to get into aviation, but not just as pilots, right? There are so many opportunities across the aviation community, and just like empowering these young girls to pursue whatever their dreams might be.
The Aviation Technician Education Council projects a shortage of 12,000 licensed mechanics by 2041. 16-year-old Josie Figueroa Duran is currently getting her A&P certification. This will allow her to work on aircraft mechanics as soon as she is done with high school. She is the only girl in her class.
It's just really discouraging sometimes to not find girls in classes, or for guys to be like, oh, like, you're a girl, like, you're not going to be able to do that, like, you're weak or whatever. And it's like, no, like, I can do the exact same thing as you, or probably even better.
But camps like Girl Venture show these girls that the sky is not the limit.
Anything is possible. You just have to set your mind to it, go jump into it, and you can get there.
Maggie Vespa, NBC News.
Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.